All right, well, thanks everyone for sticking it out. Hope you'll find this worth your while. Where I'd like to open up, I'd kind of like to open up with a story and pick up on a point that Andrew in his excellent presentation touched on. When he made his point about how the German innovation associated Blitzkrieg allowed their army to do the unthinkable and be in Paris in 3 weeks. What the story I want to tell, though, is the role of enhancements in ensuring that success. Because to make that move happen, General Guderian had to get his army of German tanks to the Ardennes forest in less than 3 days and take the city of Sedan. Otherwise, reinforcing French and British tanks units would arrive and he would be both outgunned and outnumbered. What may not have been obvious from the pictures Andrew showed was the French and British tanks were actually better than the German ones, and they had more of them. But they had distributed them among the infantry, so they could only move as fast as the infantry, and so the only hope the Germans had was to outmaneuver them. The problem was that at normal rates of march, even for the more mobile tank formations, moving that fast would be impossible unless they could fight continuously day and night without stopping and no rest. Pretty significant obstacle for an army of that size. To overcome it, Dr. Otto F. Ranke, who was the director of the Research Institute of Defense Physiology, prescribed the drug Pervitin, itself a variation of crystal methamphetamine, to the attacking force. The drug had previously been used in smaller numbers in Poland, but reportedly with good effect. As a result of that prior success, the German army had ordered the production of 35 million more tablets, enough of which were available for the invasion of France, that the invading force was able to drive through the Ardennes in time to beat the reinforcing British and French soldiers and thus force France's surrender a few weeks later. Now, of course, and this is sort of, talking about narratives, this is sort of the narrative enhancements, where this increased alertness and endurance, there's always the downside, provided by the Pervitin, came with some negative effects. Excessive use eventually caused circulatory and cognitive disorders and eventually degraded the performance of the German army. In some cases, it caused soldiers to become so jittery, they imagined enemies who were not there. In one case, an SS unit, typically a very, one of the most disciplined, was evilly overrun by a Russian unit because after days of continued Pervitin use, they had expended all of their ammunition firing at noises. So when the Russians attacked, they couldn't resist. And even before the invasion of France, Ranke himself, who took Pervitin on a regular basis, himself had expressed concern about the side effects and insisted that its use be moderated and monitored. The fact that his concerns were rarely adhered to emphasized the moral force that short-term military necessity can have on overriding more humanitarian and normative concerns, even when those are directed at one's own people. Now, my point here isn't to overstate the negative effects and argue for a cautious approach to adopting certain kinds of enhancements. Acting ethically does not mean one shouldn't take risks, even ethical ones. And those who have argued that enhancements are coming are right. There's too much to gain and not enough to lose by developing and implementing measures that increase soldier survivability and lethality. The other side is going to do it, so we better too. But there are, as we've talked several times throughout this conference, concerns about what rules we should adopt in developing, acquiring these enhancements. And to get to that, I'm going to sketch a basic framework for ethical analysis for human enhancement in general and briefly discuss how military enhancements impact its logic, as well as articulate what kind of ethical issues military enhancements uniquely raise. Then I'm going to address some additional normative concerns associated with acquisitions and as they're related to military enhancement. And first among them is the concern about how enhancements affect soldiers' exercise of moral autonomy, as things that compromise autonomy tend to fall in the category of things that are unethical. What will be apparent from that discussion is that accounting for the exercise of moral autonomy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for any particular enhancement to be considered ethical. Also, you also need to account for other things, such as the effect of the enhancement, its necessity, and the proportionality associated with its use. These conditions would, of course, account for all the ethical concerns I'll raise, but we'll save that for Q&A. What I hope to do is give you a better feel for what kinds of ethical issues enhancements raise that other military acquisition, procurement, training, education, and so on programs don't. Before I do that, I'm first going to define enhancement, because we need to be clear, at least in terms for the ethical analysis, what we mean. And here I think the question asked yesterday about the difference between enhancement and optimization, I thought was actually a pretty good one, at least in terms of helping us tease out our ethical concerns. Here's how I think about it. is when it comes to optimization, it's the realization of a potential that I have. Whereas enhancement is creating a whole new potential, whether giving me capabilities I don't have, or improving a capability I already have beyond what counts as, best possible but normal human function. For example, I might be able to run an 8-minute mile, or at least I used to, but for a variety of reasons associated with pain levels, laziness, oxygen levels in my blood, I typically don't run that fast. Something that helped me overcome those obstacles so that I could basically function at my optimal, but within normal range, I think would be treatment or therapy for optimization. But no matter what you do, I can't run a 1-minute mile, no matter how well, I overcame those kinds of obstacles to increase speed. Something that enabled me to do that would certainly count as an enhancement. But I also think there's a little more to it than that. So for the purposes of the ethical discussion, I want to focus on measures that include some kind of intervention into the human body. And not everything we talked about fell into that category. Now, it's not that they don't raise ethical concerns, but I think the hard cases are those enhancements, here's my definition, that include any medical or biological intervention to the body intended to improve a capability beyond the range of optimal human functioning or provide one capability that did not otherwise exist. This is because those interventions typically come at a cost, and because the human body, as a number of prior speakers have pointed out, is a complex adaptive system, it's hard to know in advance what those costs might be. In the military context, I also think it's worth distinguishing between what I'll call offensive and defensive measures. Since the best defense is a good offense, in some sense, all measures may be considered defensive. However, there is a difference between measures intended to protect soldiers from the effects of enemy weapons and those that increase soldier lethality. The former reduces risk to soldiers, but because they are defensive in nature, they do not expose the soldier to additional risk. The latter, on the other hand, makes it more likely the soldier will be exposed to the enemy because they would be, by virtue of the enhancement, better able to manage the risks associated with combat than the non-enhanced soldier. For example, in the Persian Gulf War, the U.S. provided pyridostigmine bromide to U.S. soldiers to protect them against the effects of nerve gaffes. I would call that a defensive measure since its intent was simply to prevent the particular effect of a particular weapon. On the other hand, drugs like Pervitin that we just discussed, which were intended to improve physical and cognitive endurance, would count as offensive since the intended effect was to enhance soldier lethality. Now what I want to talk about is trying to introduce a framework for sort of sorting out what the normative issues are going to be. I'm going to start with one that was developed for civil society by Patrick Lynn and Fritz Allhoff, who argue that the ethics of human enhancement in general are informed by 4 overlapping categories of issues. That's freedom and autonomy, health and safety, fairness and equity, social disruption, and human dignity. Regarding freedom and autonomy, in applying these concerns to human enhancement in civil society, they note that it's on the surface, the freedom to choose how one lives one's life suggests that there should be few restrictions on the kinds of enhancements persons should be allowed to pursue or accept. However, if unrestricted, that exercise of that freedom raises a number of other concerns, and the first is the second category, health and safety. Not only can the physical effect of enhancements negatively affect the individual who receives them, it can place a burden on society when those effects are more than the individual can bear. Further constraining any right to pursue enhancements is the concept of fairness and equity. Fairness arises out of the concern that anyone who possesses an enhancement has an advantage relative to those who do not, which can lead to greater permanent inequality over time. If the wealthy are typically the ones who obtain enhancements first, and these enhancements make them even better able to obtain more income or other resources, then this raises the concerns of long-term equity. And when you have that going on, the concern of equity naturally segues into the concern regarding social disruption. From the perspective of civil society, inequality can drive unrest. Side effects can drive up medical costs, and enhance, especially new capabilities, can affect human behavior in unexpected ways. Finally, Lynn and Allhoff are also concerned about enhancements' effects on human dignity. To the extent they make life too easy or the acquisition of attributes without the struggle associated with them, they may hinder the kind of moral development that allows us to realize human potential. That ties into a point Lenny Wong made. Struggle is critical to fully realizing our dignity as human beings. Now, the conditions under which enhancements are employed in a military context operates under a slightly different logic than those of civil society. In civil society, the purpose of an enhancement is to enhance quality of life. So it makes little sense to tolerate much in the way of suffering or other costs, either for the individual or society. In the military context, however, the purpose of enhancements is to increase lethality and survivability. Therefore, depending on the quality of the enhancement, it may make sense to tolerate a great deal of suffering, as well as high cost to society, depending on the circumstances. And this difference in logic suggests norms associated with military enhancements will be very different than in civil contexts. So in the military context, respecting freedom and autonomy is less concerned with whether one should be prohibited from receiving an enhancement, as much as whether one may be forced to receive one. To the extent the enhancement represents the best response to an enemy advantage, military necessity will place a great deal of pressure on commanders to offer them to soldiers and for soldiers to accept them. In providing the enhancement, however, one should not only consider the health and safety of the individual who receives it, but also the health and safety of those who do not, as the latter are, in the military context, are less capable than their enhanced comrades of handling the rigors of combat and thus surviving. Thus, this differential in capability introduces additional inequities as the military crafts policies in regarding how enhanced and non-enhanced soldiers are treated. It might seem unfair to provide some soldiers enhancements while denying it to others. But to the extent these enhancements make the soldier more lethal, they also make it, as I noted a little bit before, more likely that they'll see combat and thus exposed to more risk. Thus, in the military context, the inequality can accrue to the enhanced soldier rather to the non-enhanced. So again, what matters may not be who gets to receive the enhancement as much as who must. Moreover, as Trey mentioned, we have to consider the impact on society, which not only depends on its military for security, but which also must care for those soldiers after the war is over. This means not only caring for those who experience side effects, but also finding a role for enhanced individuals after they have left the military. So to the extent enhancements introduce additional equities into civil society or impose burdens associated with medical treatment and integration, they have potentially destabilizing costly effects that will need to be managed. Furthermore, how society treats enhanced soldiers is a special concern for human dignity, but not just because of the potentially debilitating and isolating effects enhancements can cause. While those concerns are important, enhancements may also affect how society regards and rewards military service. Society rewards its soldiers precisely because they expose themselves to risks and hardships so the rest of society does not have to. However, to the extent soldiers employ cognitional enhancements that control fear, or physical ones to eliminate the source of fear, such as a neural implant that allows soldiers to control weapons remotely, such regard and rewards will seem misplaced. If one does not experience fear, it makes no sense to reward one for displays of courage. Now, while enhancing soldier survivability and lethality always makes moral sense, enhancing it to the point of near invulnerability, or even the perception, will profoundly alter the warrior identity. We were just talking about that in the last presentation. These enhancements that we're talking about are going to have dramatic effects on how we think of ourselves as members of the military. Soldiers who experience neither risk nor sacrifice are not really soldiers as we conceive them now, and are likely better thought, maybe, depending on the enhancement, as technicians than warriors. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is something we need to prepare for. Now, with these concerns in mind, I want to briefly address some other concerns associated with military enhancements. And I'll start with the problem of moral autonomy. Informed consent is a cornerstone of medical ethics. However, as the story of stimulant use in the German army suggests, it may not be entirely relevant when it comes to enhancements, at least under certain conditions. As one German bomber pilot who participated in the Battle of Britain stated, "One wouldn't abstain from Pervitin because of a little health scare. Who cares when you're doomed to come down at any moment anyway?" So offering such an enhancement forces the soldier to choose between, or can force the soldier to choose between an increased likelihood of survival, but with possible long-term and severe side effects on one hand, and increased likelihood of death or serious injury on the other. Depending on how much soldiers perceive how receiving an enhancement affects those possible outcomes, they have few good reasons not to accept it. As long as the side effects are not lethal or significantly debilitating, suffering them will always make some kind of sense. Placing someone in such a situation where they have to choose between the possibilities of death or merely suffering, in effect robs them to a degree of their autonomy. By constraining their choices to outcomes they would not otherwise choose, it's very much like Marlon Brando's Godfather, offering them a choice they can't refuse. The question then is, would it ever be permissible to override a soldier's autonomy and offer, much less mandate, and enhancements? Soldiers have already, by joining, consented to take some risks. They take risks not only in combat, they take risks in training. In fact, soldiers consent to medical procedures, at least in the U.S. Army, can be forced to undergo medical procedures if it's necessary to return them to duty. In resolving this, I think it's useful to go back to the distinction between defensive and offensive enhancements that I introduced earlier. In general, it's fair to act without someone's consent when no one is worse off and at least some are better off. As Isaac Applebaum notes, if a general principle sometimes is to a person's advantage and never to that person's disadvantage, at least relative to the other alternatives available, then actors who are guided by that principle can be understood to act for the sake of that person. An example here, I think, is the nerve antidote I discussed earlier. To the extent everyone who received the pill had an equal chance of exposure to the gas, and a more or less equal chance, at least given what we knew at the time, of experiencing side effects, then no one was worse off than any of the others. To the extent some would be exposed to sarin, and although it is worth noting that never happened, then at least some would be better off. Given those conditions, then it was probably justified to override individual consent and implement the measure. This notion of fairness, however, does not seem to work as well with offensive enhancements. Given the logic of military necessity, it just makes sense, as I noted before, to commit one's most survivable lethal systems to battle, since they stand the best chance to defeat the enemy. Thus, it seems reasonable to expect that those who have offensive enhancements will more likely be committed to direct combat than those who do not. While it's possible these enhancements will offset some of that risk, statistically speaking, repeated exposure to danger ensures at some point one will be harmed. This point means that by accepting offensive enhancements, soldiers could be worse off than those who do not accept them. Not only do they likely experience increased risks, they also have to deal with whatever side effects the enhancements entail. And the point here isn't that offensive enhancements may not ever be permitted. Recall that the horns of this dilemma rest on the assumption that soldiers who refuse the enhancement will be committed to battle anyway and experience the same risks as the enhanced soldier. The way out then is to alleviate those conditions that compromise the soldier's autonomy in the first place. Doing so requires meeting three conditions. Soldiers must have the option to consent to the enhancement. Their consent must be informed, and if they do not consent, they will not be required to accept as much risk as enhanced soldiers. What risk they are compelled to take, it will be more or less in line with other non-enhanced soldiers. Basically, all I'm saying is when it comes to offensive enhancement, enhanced soldiers must be genuine volunteers. Now, a few other conditions also apply. The first one is moral effect. And all this is saying is that to the extent an enhancement contributes or has the effect of violating some other moral norm, it's probably going to be impermissible. For example, in Vietnam, improper use of the drug of amphetamines led to increased addiction as well as increased incidents of friendly fire incidences and indiscriminate use of force against civilians. While these are bad outcomes, in this context, you have to, you have to distinguish between use and abuse. To the extent amphetamine use necessarily entails, or at least makes highly likely, indiscriminate and disproportionate force, it's probably impermissible. On the other hand, to the extent that properly regulated use provides some benefit and avoids the bad effects, then the issue lies not with the enhancement itself, but how it's applied by the recipients of the medical professionals who prescribe them. So that falls under the normal, and that falls under the normal rules of medical ethics. Just a couple short. The other two I'm going to talk about real quick is just necessity and proportional. And the point with necessity is this. Military necessity is typically considered in terms of what not just is necessary to defeat the enemy, but what does so most effectively. So anything, in this review, anything that gives an advantage typically would count as morally necessary. And that's fine as far as it goes. However, given the negative effects enhancements can have on one's own soldiers, I don't think it's enough. I think you also have to add, it must also avoid a disadvantage. This point doesn't suggest military leaders should not pursue technological or any other kind of overmatch against the enemy. However, given that potential and possibly unforeseen consequences, if one can win war without of enhancements, if one can win war without them, one probably should. Regarding proportionality, the big point here is proportionality is doing more good than harm. In the context of enhancement, though, those goods and harms accrue to the soldier, the military, and society. The difficulty in this calculation, then, is grouped together, though the goods and harms that accrue are incommensurable. How much extra security for society is worth what kind of side effect for the soldier? Given that medical compensation costs can be incurred for years, what dollar amount exceeds the military advantage achieved, or perhaps more importantly, the disadvantage avoided when adversaries pursue and implement the same enhancements? These concerns do not entail proportionality cannot apply here. It just means the calculation won't be straightforward and may require some thought on how to address the incommensurability described above. So finally, taken together, the real risk of enhancements may be in how their application will affect the soldier and thus the military's profession's relationship with the larger society it serves. Changing the nature of the soldier changes the military, and changes in the military can have profound impacts on society. The point here is not to avoid them. The rapid pace of technological development, especially in the context of international competition, assures that enhancements will be a part of future military acquisitions. The point here is that the policies regarding the ethics of enhancements will also constantly evolve, and this policymakers will require constant attention to the moral concerns, which hopefully I've just outlined, that are associated with it. And thank you very much.